Hi everyone, Titus here for part 14 of our Flashbang mini-series, and in this video, we'll be texture painting our model and creating 3 new texture maps that we can bring into Unreal Engine. Let's not waste any more time and jump right into it. Alright, in the last one we imported our model and we completed the baking process, and we created 5 texture maps. These texture maps we're actually going to be kind of pulling some of the information from them and creating 3 output maps, and that's mainly because Unreal Engine can't handle a lot of these extra maps, so we're basically going to have to mix some of them, and then we're going to have to pull from their specific channels, but I'll show you kind of what I mean here in a second. Let's go ahead and jump over to the texture tab. Actually, real quick, let's create a new texture project by clicking on this little easel, and then we got to set up our texture project real quick. You can go on the right panel under the materials, and I named it _UV, but it's whatever you named it in Blender when we were doing our UV unwrapping. Select that so it's highlighted. Then on the left hand side you can click this little cube icon. It'll kind of move that material over, and it should load most of the maps. If it doesn't, just click on the little squares and click on the corresponding texture maps. So this one's curvature, we'll choose curve. This one's normal OBJ, so we'll select the normal OBJ. And this is the mat ID or material ID, so that's this one right here. From there we can scroll to the bottom, and we have to set up our export location. I'm going to choose the same place. I'm going to choose it to be a PNG, just to keep things uniform. And then this one I'll call Flashbang _UE_bake, because this will let me know that these are the texture maps that I'm bringing into Unreal Engine. So hit save. Unfortunately, even though you set the PNG under the export settings, it will overwrite with the map designation. So the default is TGA with Marmoset, so I'm going to set that to PNG on each of them. And this section is actually important, mainly because what I was saying earlier, when we're in Unreal Engine, we're going to have to create a material instance, and we're going to feed these 3 texture maps in that material instance, and we're going to have to pull from their specific channels into, I guess, their corresponding values. So red is going to go into our ambient occlusion, green's going to be our roughness, blue's going to be our metalness, and we're going to pull the RGB channels from the albedo into the color and the normal maps. That'll make more sense in the next video though, but just calling it out now. Alright, let's go ahead and head over to the texture workspace. The first thing I would say to do is, if you don't see any of these sections, they might be collapsed, so just look for these little arrows here, and you can expand them out. For the texture map, it might be all black or all white. Just hit the little gear cog and make sure wireframe is enabled, so you can kind of see what you're doing. And then we have a list of all the materials libraries right here. You can expand out. We're going to be mainly working in materials and textures, because we're not going to be doing direct painting. We're basically just going to be doing like flood filling and using some masks and stuff. But, so let's go ahead and kind of show you what this looks like. Let's expand out the materials, and you have some metal sections here, and this is kind of where Marmoset shines, because it just has a lot of these available for you. Anything with a cloud or a download icon, you can just double click. It'll actually pull it down. Once you have it, you can drag it up, and because we color coded and baked the material IDs on each of our parts, we can drag a particular color onto, or a material onto any of these different colors, and it'll apply it to, whatever the color base is there. So that can be really handy. Let's go ahead and right click and delete that one, and let's look at something goofy like aluminium foil. So if we did that on the yellow here, you can see it doesn't add it to the whole model, it just adds it to, you know, that color-coded section. If you wanted to play with the settings on this layer settings panel, you can adjust the texture maps that this material applies to. So like if you didn't want the color, you can disable the color for that. If you didn't want the metalness, you can disable that. The normal is the bumpiness. So if you get rid of that, and bring back the metalness. So you can play around and get some different effects or different looks just by enabling and disabling what texture maps these actually apply to. And then of course you can adjust the values. Albedo is of course color, so you can make something darker or brighter. And then your roughness sliders, you know, something shiny or, you know, how kind of like dull or flat it looks. And then metalness, of course, that's the value. That value should just be 0 or 1, so whether it's metal or not. And then you can get some interesting contrast too by just bumping this up. I will play with the contrast on the normal map quite a bit because you can get some interesting effects there, so that's a fun one to do. And then your bump as well. Ambient occlusion, I don't really know if it does much anything, so I don't play with that one too much, but that's basically most of the values in a nutshell. But let's go ahead and delete our aluminum foil, get rid of that. And one that I really like is nickel pocked. Now instead of dragging it onto each individual piece, if you just drag it into the layers section, it'll apply the material to the entire model. You can also switch between your different texture maps at the top here. We obviously are working in the albedo or color section. And I like the nickel pocked because it has a lot of good normal information in it. It's very realistic. But I don't want the whole thing to be this color. So we're gonna add like a paint layer. And the easiest way to do that is what's called a fill layer. So you can just right click over here, add a fill layer. But I like the nickel pock's bumpiness, so I'm going to disable the normal on the fill layer. And that's gonna let the sub layer, which is the nickel pocked, shine through. Kind of like that. So now what we can do is just adjust the color. I'm gonna go for maybe kind of like maybe a brown or a green or something. Something like that. That looks pretty okay. Very military. Once I am happy with, you can always adjust the color later too, so you know, don't stress too much on it. But once you have a color, what we're gonna do is we're gonna create a mask, and then we're only going to color certain parts, and we're gonna use a procedural texture, which is gonna be like a scratch mark, and we're gonna have that metal shine through the procedural texture base, basically. So what we can do is right click on the fill layer and then go to mask and then do fill mask black, and that comes up and it kind of gets rid of your color, but don't worry, because then what you'll want to do is on the fill layer, right click on it, and we're going to go to the layer, and this time we're going to go to a processor, and I'm going to use a scratch processor, which I consider like a procedural texture, kind of like same thing. And there you go. Now you'll notice, it's got the colors inverted, but you can kind of see it. The edges are green, and then the majority of it's metal. So what you can do is, when you're in the scratch layer, there's this little color icon. If you click on that, it'll invert it. Just like that. And that looks actually pretty good. Now when you add the scratch layer, you have these two sections for grunge and scratch. I'm going to collapse my material section and go into my textures, and then you have your grunge maps right here. I don't really know what the grunge does. It feels like it doesn't really do much, so I usually ignore that one. But the scratch layer is where all the magic happens. So like just as an example, we can do like fingerprint heavy, pop that into there, and now suddenly you have a little bit of a interesting look here. What you can do is you can increase so under the scratch settings, you can increase the intensity here, and you can get, all sorts of different looks. You can also adjust the contrast if you want to bring it like more color. I think a higher value will bring the green back, or it'll make it like sharper. Actually, no, lower value, sorry. Anyway. So you can kind of play and see what you're kind of looking for. Maybe come around there. And then you can adjust your scratch contrast as well. Down here, you can make looks like brighter or kind of duller. And then obviously play with your intensities. And then your scratch scale is how big or small. So I think the higher the number, the smaller the scratches. Kind of like that. Or kind of like over here. And this is kind of like what I was saying before. If you notice small imperfections in your bake, a lot of it's not going to show up when you actually start adding color to it. So you can get away with a lot. So don't feel too discouraged. A lot of these texture materials is going to be, trial and error. So just kind of play with different maps and different settings. But what I was saying before, like with the grunge, if we remove the scratch and we add it to the grunge map, I don't really notice much of a difference. So I think it adds it or layers it on top, but even still, if I remove this, maybe some subtle differences, but not much. Let's try some other ones here though. Scratch is medium. The intensity is way too high on that one. Let's bump that down. And I think the contrast, maybe around there. So with procedural textures too, the other thing with our UV unwrap process that I did mention before, but is worth bringing up in this instance, when we were doing the UV unwrapping, we were focused on mainly stretching, but we were also focusing on texture space too. So we had some parts of the model, like specifically the handle, where we cut it up a lot, and most of the time you're fine if you do that, especially if you're hand painting anything, it's not going to matter. But if you're doing a procedural texture and you cut something up, a bunch of times, and then you're just packing the UV islands, pragmatically, like you're not manually placing them, you might find that the handle gets cut up like 1,000 times, and parts of it are here and parts of it are over there. They're all in different areas of the texture map. They're not like next to each other. So if you had a procedural texture, it's going to apply the procedure to the texture map, and if the parts aren't near each other, the model could look weird. So it is something to kind of bear in mind. But like I said, a lot of it you can get away with though, so just kind of experiment, see what you like. I really like the fingerprints heavy though, so I think I am going to go back with that one. I think that's a pretty cool look. Alright, so now I don't want this look to kind of be everywhere. Actually, one other thing I want to do. Something right around there. Yeah, I think that looks good. I'm going to go back to the nickel pocked, and another thing I like to do is I like to bump up the contrast. And there it is. You can get these interesting kind of like rainbow effects. I guess maybe kind of like burn looks. So the more scratches or the more, if you have heavy procedure, you can get some of this bleed through, which looks pretty good. But yeah, so I'm pretty happy with my scratch layer, so I think I will collapse that now. Now what you can do is just select both the layers here with Shift Select, right click and do Group Selected. So it creates this little group, and we can hit the folder just to collapse it. And then you can just right click on the group, and then there's an option for mask, and we're just going to do a paint mask black. What this is going to allow us to do is it's telling Marmoset like, hey, I liked this setup, let's make it like a paint bucket and let me strategically fill what I want to fill, and then I'll use other colors for the rest of the model. So now that we have that, we can come up here and hit our little fill bucket, and then you can just point and click and it will just fill whatever parts of the model you want to color code there. Maybe I'll see how it looks with the fuse. I might change the fuse head there. Alright, but I think that looks pretty good. I'm going to go back into my materials, and under metal, I think I'm going to find a nice chrome brushed. Now remember, our pins were all one material ID, so if I add my chrome brushed onto any of those, it's going to selectively target each part of the pin. Now that looks pretty good. I'm going to go with a brass on the interior, so I'm just going to drag this brass material there. And for this piece, that was kind of like red looking on my reference, so I'm just going to go to paint. I have a paint glossy, I'll drag that in there. And under the albedo on the material properties, I'm just going to bump that to a red and make it really bright, and then click OK. And I think that looks pretty good. Now we also had the back part of the handle had a different color, so you can experiment with that. It was actually kind of a yellowish. Actually, no. Let me make it red. See how that looks. I think yellow looks better, but most of it's just kind of mess around with it, see what you like. And then the text, I'm going to use Paint Cracked Heavy. You want to zoom in so you can really target it, and you just want to drag it onto the pink, and then it'll kind of hit that just there, and then we can adjust the albedo to be a different color or just make it brighter, and then fill out our texture map. If you don't like the way the fuse looks, we can also go back into metal. There's an anodize, so you can drop that in there, see how that looks. Maybe that's more of the look you're going for. And then if there's parts of the model that you find that would look better with a different mask, you can go back into Blender and under the high poly, just carve out a new section, create a new material instance, or basically like a new color, and then just color tag it differently, and then re-import it into Marmoset, and then you can kind of set it up that way too. Other ideas. Like I said, a lot of it's just kind of like experimentation, just playing around with it. I think that looks pretty good. I know we also created a material for the middle. I don't know if I'm going to use it though. Let me try Paint Cracked. I'm not going to do heavy, let's just try Paint Cracked. Hit that there. And then maybe change it to make it blue. Maybe match it with a red. definitely interesting. I'll say that. But yeah, I mean, it's kind of like, I guess, whatever you're looking for. So, a lot of different ways to go about it. And I think this is really where Marmoset shines, is just because doing this in Blender would take a while. Like, you have some noise textures, you know, like Musgrave and whatnot. But just having this library of all these different material instances, brushes, like this is pretty cool. And just being able to drag and drop like that, very, very useful. So I'm definitely a fan. But once you find you know, something you're happy with, bring it over and move the light around, see if it looks all right. Once you're happy with it, what you can do is we got to prepare it for bringing it into Unreal Engine. So the first thing you'll want to do is, under your texture project, make sure you export all. So you hit export, and then you'll notice it should create the maps. So we have those ready for Unreal Engine. So there's our color, or albedo. This one's going to be the normal. And this is the mixture maps, which is combining the ambient occlusion, the OBJ, and I believe the curve. I forget what the other one was. Once you have those created, we'll want to also export the model. I am going to delete the high poly version because I mean, you might want to import the high poly and the low poly into Unreal if you were doing something different with the high poly, maybe. There's not a lot of workflows that I can imagine that being useful, just because it is so dense. So even if you were using it like as a menu item, there's still probably better ways to do it. But this part is optional, I guess. So I'm going to expand out each section, and then I'm going to right-click under the high and just hit delete. I basically collapse high, and then I right-click on it, delete it, and just kind of go through each one. So only the low poly is left. And that's just going to make it, when we go to Unreal Engine, when I import it, I don't want to see the high poly parts. I only want to see the low poly. And it just makes it easier to work in the browser that way. But once you got it, you can render it out, but we're going to be exporting. So now I'm going to go to File, Export. I'm going to select FBX. I'm going to select my location, which is going to be the same. I'm going to title it as Flashbang UE Final. I'm going to uncheck materials, and I'm going to uncheck lights and leave embedded assets unchecked. So all I want is the model. Just the model, and then we've already exported the maps. Should be everything we need. We'll hit export. And that's pretty much it. Alright, good people. This concludes the Marmoset Toolbag 4 tutorial section. So in the next video, we'll bring the model into Unreal Engine. We'll have to build it, and then kind of see how it looks after we create our material instance. And then maybe we'll do some like special code and kind of actually do some fun stuff with it. But as always, thanks for watching, consider subscribing, and see you on the next one.